Welcome. So there's been some challenges these last couple of weeks. Challenges with anxiety and panic attacks. And the challenges of anxiety have been with me for quite a few years, but not until a couple of weeks ago. I hadn't suffered with panic attacks before. One thing I've noticed with anxiety is it can self-perpetuate very quickly. The brain will quickly make associations, such as if you were in the car and anxiety arose, the brain may say, okay, let's not go into any cars. And I find anxiety is very complex. It can, of course, be simple as well. But what I've experienced is it's very difficult to trace back all of the sources of where the anxiety has formed. Often you can point to one or two things. There may be something that's more intense, more obvious that comes to mind. Think, okay, if I was to point to a source of anxiety, that would be the first place I would mention. So for me, I spent 3 or 4 days focusing on breathing through my nose. I talked before about the benefits of nasal breathing, and I'm just wondering if I've mentioned this in the last episode. I can't quite remember, but I'll mention it again. So I spent 2 to 3 days of, maybe more, breathing through my nose, and only my nose. And as my nasal passages are quite blocked, it was a struggle. Often only very little air, or what seemed like very little air, would come through. And there was the feeling of suffocation. I was aware that suffocation wasn't happening, of course, it was just a thought, and what may have happened is anxiety building up around that. The thought of not getting enough air. And I was hyper-focused on the airflow going through my nose. I was always doing my best to unblock it. I'd always be sniffing, and there'd be a lot of attention on trying to make it easier to breathe through my nose. lots of anxiety there that maybe I didn't acknowledge, or I wouldn't say I pushed it down, but I was very determined to continue breathing through the nose. And one of the things they mention is the more you do it, the more clear the nose will get, the more easier it will become. So with the resistance, the physical resistance, I had that determination to almost go through that tunnel, to continue to struggle with breathing as hard as it was, and then once the passages have opened up, then it will be easier after that. So almost going through the pain barrier. But one night I woke up, the nose was clogged, what felt like it's blocked, and there was panic. And I've had this panic before. It's usually when I've got a cold, and on the second or third day of having a cold, the nose becomes completely blocked. And when I'm lying in bed at night, I may wake up and then there'd be the sense that I couldn't breathe as well, which was true. The nose was blocked. But it was perhaps just the power of the thought that I'm not being able to get as much oxygen as normal that sets off the panic. So this was almost a very intense version of that, a prolonged version of that. And I mentioned that one can be susceptible for that anxiety to increase on its own. It almost feeds itself. So I found these panic attacks increasing, happening almost every night. I would wake up, I'd feel that my nose is blocked, and my chest would tighten and a panic attack will begin. And this has been happening even after I dropped the intention to breathe through my nose. And it's almost as if when you notice something that you do naturally, you put all your attention on it, there's a different feel to it. It almost feels like you're artificially doing something that you've been doing it naturally for years, for your entire life. So all that attention on the breathing there's almost a nervousness there, or there's almost a difficulty in that. And maybe it's partly where even now I can feel it with breathing, it feels quite a struggle to breathe. And I'm aware this isn't something physical, because a month or two ago I thought I had trouble breathing. The ambulance came, they did all their tests and told me your body is getting the perfect amount of oxygen it needs. So now there's the case of not trying to add to this anxiety. The one thing I don't want to happen is to, every time I go to bed and lie down, I'm already thinking about panic attacks, or I'm building anxiety. And for the moment that's not happening. There is some anxiety on a difficult day before going to bed. But I'm doing what I can to not add to it. So if I wake up, the panic is there, such as last night I woke, felt like I couldn't breathe. And it's hard to almost trying to analyze that. It happens so quickly. Perhaps there's a thought as soon as I wake that, okay, the nose is blocked. It's difficult to breathe. And also there's the physical sensation as well, so it's not all just a mental thing. So in that moment, recently I've come up with a way of almost interrupting this process of just consciously thinking of something else. To almost distract the mind from the hypervigilance of my breathing. Instead of in some ways trying to calm my breath, I'm using almost an indirect method of doing that. It seems that when I try and focus on calming my breath, the thoughts are so strong that the only thing I'm aware of is that it's a struggle to breathe. And that again adds to the thought or validates it, and it's almost a downward spiral. And then perhaps I'm over breathing, I'm taking even bigger breaths, and then often the panic increases the more your rate of breathing increases, but in your mind that's what you believe you need in that moment, so you're almost going down that spiral yourself. So for the time being I found a method of just interrupting this reaction. So it's been a challenging couple of weeks. I've even found this anxiety spill over into the day. So in the day I would have times when my mind, my attention goes to my breathing, then that reaction begins again. There's awareness, it's a struggle to breathe. And my nose may not feel blocked, but still there would be that sensation and thought that is a struggle to breathe. And immediately that makes the breathing become even more restricted. So I've noticed there's a high degree of sensitivity there. Immediately when there's a tension on, or a thought that leads to the attention to go to the breathing, and you mix in the anxiety there as well, and also some OCD. I have OCD tendencies, and this is where things can get complicated, because these things are very hard to separate out and look at, or obviously they're almost tangled together. There's a word for non-physical. I can't think of it at the moment, but maybe it's intangible, I think maybe the word. But when it comes to things that are intangible, this is when the difficulty comes with trying to analyze, and you can add to that the unwellness of the mind, where the mind is not able to clearly analyze things. It doesn't have that power. At the moment this is the case for me, that the mind is not operating on a high level, so the tool you're using, the instrument you're using to measure is itself at fault, then this is one of the reasons why I've almost dropped trying to analyze and figure out things. And there's a sense of me saying that that's not the only way to remedy this, that you have to, analysis is useful, to understand is useful, but there's also the practice of being and presence, and that's also another way. And I'm not currently on any medication at the moment for anxiety or depression. And I find this sometimes to be a bit of a barrier when talking with healthcare professionals, such as I spoke to a doctor in regards to my panic attacks, and first things they mentioned or perhaps encouraged is the use of medication. And it feels a bit of a conflict as well, because I've listened to people that I respect or I have a high opinion on out there. Some people who may have a background, spiritual background, or some sort of background in medicine where, they're saying, certain medicines may not be as effective, or you talk about the side effects as well. And especially with anti-anxiety medications, for me to feel comfortable taking them, I'd have to almost feel as I'd have to do my research. I wouldn't trust, for me personally, I wouldn't trust what's been given. I'd have to almost trace where this has come from and understand the effects of it. And just on a side note for anyone listening, this is not to say to ignore medical advice. Is always the method to work with doctors and always consult. It's always better to be informed. But it can almost feel like if, in my situation, as I'm not on medication, there's almost a bit of a judgment there. Maybe a judgment that, you're not obviously doing everything you can to help yourself. Or the judgment that, how do you expect to get better without taking medication for it? There's almost a yes, perhaps judgment is there, but it feels like the option to not take medication, do other things to help, it almost feels like that's laughable to try that. And of course, sometimes there's a feeling that the doctor always knows best. Sometimes there's that authority feeding there, and overbearing and overshadowing. So I had a difficult conversation with the doctor. They were unfortunately, in my case, they were very quick on the phone. They were very firing questions, and it was a very fast-paced phone call, and I felt almost out of my control. And at the end of the phone call, I noticed my hands were trembling, and I was even more anxious than before the phone call. Which, I was calling about anxiety, and unfortunately, it wasn't. One thing I was able to make clear that I wasn't looking to go on medication, and so we discussed other options such as CBT counselling, and that's something I'll be looking to do. But already I feel the pressure of going on medication. I can imagine at some point maybe this doctor or a doctor may say, well, you've tried all these things, okay, it's time to try this now. And of course, they'll be given their own medical opinion on what's best. But I realise we always have a choice of accepting or not as well. But again, as I mentioned, perhaps it's a sensible thing to do where I'm consulting a doctor, as hard as it is to do that. I'm doing my best to go down this path, and maybe later there will be some difficult conversations, or conversations where something would need to be made clear to the person I'm speaking to with their medical degree and their training. Perhaps in that moment there will be able to be clear communication of how I feel about this, and or perhaps there'll be a way to clearly explain why I'm not doing this or that, or what I would like as my treatment as well. So at the moment there's a balance, there's a lot of mind activity, there's a lot of anxiety feelings, and so there hasn't been a lot of opportunity or room to be present. The feelings come up very strongly. So there's been maybe a level of accepting that okay, in this moment they can't be present. I'm not able to be present in this moment. Just accepting that. So that was just something I wanted to talk about briefly, and perhaps coming up to 25 minutes, perhaps it's not so brief, but sometimes it's nice to forget about time. I've noticed that in others, if they have a watch or there's a notice of time, the importance of time, and sometimes or often there may not be anything scheduled, but still there'll be, okay, it's this time of the day, or this time has gone by, wow, okay. And maybe on a subtle level there's reactions happening there. Maybe there's emotions being created as well. And I get a sense sometimes with time, there can be a bit of a constricting emotion. You may look at the time, it's whatever time it is in a day, and you think, oh, I haven't done anything. I should have, in this amount of time, I should have done all of these things. And then there's a reaction. And there's perhaps conditioning there, conditioning of other people who, in an hour are able to do, clean the whole house or do this and that. And I find that when we look at the time, that conditioning can arise. For me, it's often that. I look at the time and think, oh, so I've done 5 hours, I've been awake and I've done absolutely nothing. And then, of course, that generates negative thoughts, and the emotions that are reflected in the body come up. And before you know it, you're thinking, oh, what am I doing with my life? And that can all come from a thought of, what's the time? It can lead you down. The longer I've travelled in this, or practiced presence and gone down this path, the more I'm still learning the power of a thought. How powerful a thought can be, how it can create waves in an instant, ripples, sort of a chain reaction of other thoughts. Just as I mentioned there, there's a thought about looking at the time, and that can lead to, what are you doing with your life? And then there's a great heaviness there. And also I noticed the contrast. When there's been a period of time of no thinking, or a period of time of being present, you can feel how light that is, how there are no words, of course, to accurately describe it fully, but perhaps we can use light for the moment, and then how heavy thinking is. But we're so used to all of the ripples in our energy, constant ripples there. It's only when perhaps there's a period of time when you're more present than thinking, then that contrast becomes clear. When there's a practice of less ripples and waves forming, when they do get generated, then there's a more sensitivity to them. We used the example before of like a loud noise. Could be a drill or a loud fan, and suddenly it turns off. You can almost notice the contrast of peace that's there, that's always there, but the noise of the mind quietens. Or when it goes to the background and the foreground becomes the peace of the moment, the stillness that's always there. But we're so used to the ripples and waves, and we're not only used to them, we get comfort from, we try and create certain waves to get comfort. We don't like that wave, but that wave's okay. We can try and create more of that, more of these ripples in our energy. And it's a constant game of reaction, and this reaction makes me happy, this one doesn't, and okay, I need to create more things to make me happy, and it's a very exhausting game. And then there's the true reality of the now, where all of this is witnessed. The attachments are witnessed, dislikes and likes. Why did this have to happen to me? Thoughts are witnessed. The struggle of the identity, trying to make itself more, trying to add something to itself, that is all witnessed. So you can be in the game of unhappiness and happiness, of the reactions, or you can be the witness or the observer. You can be the space that this happens in, that space where it's always still. It's the perceiver of movement, but the perceiver itself is not moving. Just going to open the Miracle of Mindfulness. Thought to be a good idea to keep some momentum with this book, with these passages we're reading together. And we left it at part 3, or chapter 3. It seems like there's several passages within each part or chapter. This one is called A Day of Mindfulness. Every day and every hour, one should practice mindfulness. That's easy to say, but to carry it out in practice is not. That's why I suggest to those who come to the meditation sessions that each person should try hard to reserve one day out of the week to devote entirely to their practice of mindfulness. In principle, of course, every day should be your day, and every hour your hour. But the fact is that very few of us have reached such a point. We have the impression that our family, place of work, and society rob us of all our time. So I urge that everyone set aside one day each week, Saturday perhaps. If it is Saturday, then Saturday must be entirely your day, a day during which you are completely the master. Then Saturday will be the lever that will lift you to the habit of practicing mindfulness. Every worker in a peace or service community, no matter how urgent its work, has the right to such a day, for without it we will lose ourselves quickly in a life full of worry and action, and our responses will become increasingly useless. Whatever the day chosen, it can be considered as the day of mindfulness. To set up a day of mindfulness, figure out a way to remind yourself at the moment of waking that this day is your day of mindfulness. You might hang something on the ceiling or on the wall, a paper with the word mindfulness, or a pine branch, anything that will suggest to you as you open your eyes and see it that today is your day of mindfulness. Today is your day. Remembering that, perhaps you can feel a smile which affirms that you are in complete mindfulness, a smile that nourishes that perfect mindfulness. While still lying in bed, begin slowly to follow your breath, slow, long, and conscious breaths. Then slowly rise from bed, instead of turning out all at once as usual, nourishing mindfulness by every motion. Once up, brush your teeth, wash your face, and do all your morning activities in a calm and relaxing way, each movement done in mindfulness. Follow your breath, take hold of it, and don't let your thoughts scatter. Each movement should be done calmly. Measure your steps with quiet, long breaths. Maintain a half smile. Spend at least a half hour taking a bath. Bathe slowly and mindfully, so that by the time you have finished, you feel light and refreshed. Afterwards, you might do household work such as washing dishes, dusting and wiping off the tables, scrubbing the kitchen floor, arranging books on their shelves. Whatever the tasks, do them slowly and with ease, in mindfulness. Don't do any task in order to get it over with. Resolve to do each job in a relaxed way, with all your attention. Enjoy and be one with your work. Without this, the day of mindfulness will be of no value at all. The feeling that any task is a nuisance will soon disappear if it is done in mindfulness. Take the example of the Zen masters. No matter what task or motion they undertake, they do it slowly and evenly, without reluctance. For those who are just beginning to practice, it is best to maintain a spirit of silence throughout the day. That doesn't mean that on the day of mindfulness you shouldn't speak at all. You can talk, you can even go ahead and sing, but if you talk or sing, do it in complete mindfulness of what you are saying or singing, and keep talking and singing to a minimum. Naturally, it is possible to sing and practice mindfulness at the same time, just as long as one is conscious of the fact that one is singing and aware of what one is singing. But be warned that it is much easier when singing or talking to stray from mindfulness if your meditation strength is still weak. At lunchtime, prepare a meal for yourself, cook the meal, and wash the dishes in mindfulness. In the morning, after you have cleaned and straightened up your house, and in the afternoon after you have worked in the garden or watched clouds or gathered flowers, prepare a pot of tea to sit and drink in mindfulness. Allow yourself a good length of time to do this. Don't drink your tea like someone who gulps down a cup of coffee during a work break. Drink your tea slowly and reverently, as if it is the axis on which the whole earth revolves. Slowly, evenly, without rushing toward the future. Live the actual moment. Only this actual moment is life. Don't be attached to the future. Don't worry about things you have to do. Don't think about getting up or taking off to do anything. Don't think about departing. Be a bud sitting quietly in a hedge. Be a smile, one part of wondrous existence. Stand here. There is no need to depart. This homeland is as beautiful as the homeland of our childhood. Do not harm it, please, and continue to sing. This is an excerpt from what I just read. The last 5 or 6 lines was an excerpt from Butterfly Over the Field of Golden Mustard Flowers. So that was in brackets there. I'm not sure if that's a piece of text or perhaps someone can enlighten me on that. Okay, let's continue. In the evening, you might read scripture and copy passages, write letters to friends, or do anything else you enjoy outside of your normal duties during the week. But whatever you do, do it in mindfulness. Eat only a little for the evening meal. Later, around 10 or 11 o'clock, as you sit in meditation, you will be able to sit more easily on an empty stomach. Afterwards, you might take a slow walk in the fresh night air, following your breath in mindfulness and measuring the length of your breaths by your steps. Finally, return to your room and sleep in mindfulness. Somehow we must find a way to allow each worker a day of mindfulness. Such a day is crucial. Its effect on the other days of the week is immeasurable. 10 years ago, thanks to such a day of mindfulness, Chu Van and our other sisters and brothers in the Tiep Hien order were able to guide themselves through many difficult times. After only 3 months of observing such a day of mindfulness once a week, I know that you will see a significant change in your life. The day of mindfulness will begin to penetrate the other days of the week, enabling you to eventually live 7 days a week in mindfulness. I'm sure you agree with me on the day of mindfulness's importance. Okay, and I will leave it there for this reading. that was the only passage in this chapter, and I felt that was a very substantial passage there. And maybe it's a good reminder to look back at the beginning of this book, where it mentioned these are letters to Tay's good friend who he left to take care of his foundation, if I remember correctly. So, and of course this was written back in those days, so a lot of the language would be related to some of the activities that were happening in those days, but hopefully the essence of that passage can be grasped. And if a day of mindfulness seems daunting, then there's nothing to say you can't start with an hour or even 20 minutes. And maybe you can even schedule this as well if you feel that it's important for you to have the consistency. Perhaps there's an activity in the day or week that you can do in complete mindfulness, or there's a time where it's completely your time and you're able to just do the practice of mindfulness. Practice of observing this moment, observing your breath. And I also want to remind myself, and hopefully this will echo to you, of being flexible as well. There are many books out there, many techniques, many different methods, different advice. So it's find what resonates with you. Find what brings ease and peace to your well-being each day. So if there is a book you're reading where it could be anything to do with psychology or spirituality, something that you're trying to incorporate, you can almost see what settles on you, what sticks with you without effort. Usually if there's a great deal of effort to try and do something and it's still not sticking with you, then maybe that's a sign, that's something for you to decide, is this something that serves me? So even with this book, this is of course purely about mindfulness and the Buddhist tradition. Obviously that's Thich Nhat Hanh's background there, where he became a monk at a very early age, and he follows the teachings from the scriptures. So everything we read here, it's almost take what resonates with you. There's no pressure to follow everything by the letter. This is why I believe there is so many different teachers, different styles, and it's finding what fits in with you. So in my instance, that at the moment it feels like routine can be a hindrance. It perhaps adds a bit of stress and pressure. So if I do use routine, it's done very cautiously, or it's done with flexibility there. think I would leave it here for this episode. Thank you for joining me. I wish you well in this moment, and I'll speak to you again very soon. Take care.